Hey, Lab of Doom guy here. Today, I wanted to talk to you about something I find interesting, and hopefully you will find it interesting too. Let's get to it, shall we? So, in my family's lore, there is mention that we are related to Native Americans. Of course, if you didn't know, a lot of other American families have this kind of story too. And just like many of those, my parents didn't actually have any details or any actual proof. So we didn't know what to believe. Knowing my parents, it was likely to be more rumor than fact. Let's just say that we were skeptical. But to a guy like me, who spent a lot of his youth watching cowboy and Indian movies on lazy Sunday afternoons, well, that's a mystery that you don't forget. At some point, me and my siblings got genetic testing from various different companies, and I thought we would get a little closer to the truth. As we expected, we're almost all European, which is fine, but not terribly exciting based on our known family history. But there, at the bottom of the list, past Ireland, Germany, Sweden, etc., was 2% African from the Liberia-Ghana region. You know, there's a meme I saw on Reddit's 23andMe group about Caucasians who receive results reflecting minuscule amounts of African DNA, probably due to some rounding error. Now, I wasn't going to go that far, but it was consistent in my siblings' results too, so it was less likely to be a fluke if it was reported over multiple competing datasets. If we do the math, 2% is between 5 and 6 generations back with a single person of African descent as my ancestor. That's not too far, but who was it? I didn't know, and neither did anybody in my family. Luckily, there are a lot of resources out there to help you uncover such mysteries. I'm sure you have seen the Ancestry.com commercials, but there are also free resources like open source family tree software, graveyard searches, public records, that sort of thing. So I was looking at www.findagrave.com, pretty morbid, right? When I find this image with this description. Born a slave, William Carter Ross was the son of Nancy Ross and Morson Green, a Virginia merchant and aristocrat. William became a Buffalo soldier in 1878 when he joined the U.S. Cavalry, mustering out in 1883 as a first sergeant. His first wife, Ans Chiss, a Cheyenne Arapaho, gave him 4 children. Dusty Bull, who his father called Marcus Aurelius, died at age 4. Standing 20 died when he was 2, and the other 2 lived to adulthood, Margaret M. and Alexander Morson. Ans Chiss died, and William married her best friend, Mina Schoonover Ashford, and they had 7 children. This is sourced from Virginia Shade, an African-American history at Falmouth, Virginia. Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that description. Well, Ans Chiss probably explains the family connection to Native Americans. It just turns out that we were only related to her by marriage, as our line was produced from the second marriage. Like I said, there's a lot to unpack in that description, and we'll have to come back to some of that later. But the line that catches my attention right there is born a slave. Since Morson Green was a merchant and aristocrat in Virginia during the time of the Civil War, dimes to donuts, he wasn't of African descent. But if his son was born a slave, then his mother was likely a slave. If William Carter's mother, Nancy Ross, was a slave, she was most likely the source of my African genes. She was my leading suspect anyhow. Unfortunately, my attempts to find her in the grave search were a bit fruitless. However, I did find a death certificate. It says right there, black, widowed to A.M. Green, which I'm guessing is Alexander Morson Green from the previous statement, and 85 years old in 1924, meaning she was born approximately 1839. Mother unknown, father unknown. The trail ends there because we don't have any more information, but at 5 generations back, she fits the case that we were stating earlier about 2%. But of course, the description just stirs up more questions. Some other records put some light on how odd an arrangement the relationship between A.M. Green and Nancy Ross were. Here I find the 1860 slave census in Stafford County, Virginia, and A.M. Green apparently had 12 slaves under his rule. The slaves are unnamed, but notice the 20-year-old female on the list, an age in which coincides with Nancy's. A decade later, after the Civil War was ended, we have the 1870 census, and lo and behold, everyone has a name under the law. Nancy is Alexander Morson's 33-year-old quote-unquote cook, and William Carter is the 12-year-old mulatto boy. Turns out that Alexander Morson was the slave master of both his de facto wife and his children. Now, I don't want to judge a different time and a different place, but that has to be a complicated situation. The short bio on his Find a Grave indicates this. Alec Green was the son of a prominent Virginia merchant. He attended Virginia Military Institute, class of 48, but there is no record that he graduated. During the Civil War, he joined the Confederate Army. Alec never married, but he had 9 children with Nancy Ross. Ross, his cook, and one of his slaves. Their first 2 children were born as slaves, William Carter Ross and Mary Ross, sourced from Virginia Shade in the African American History of Falmouth, Virginia. He never married. His first 2 children were slaves, and after slavery ended, they have 7 more children. The guy lives in Virginia, fights for the Confederacy, and ends up being lifelong partners with his slave. What kind of guy is this? Was their relationship a matter of convenience, or was there more to it? Now, as a slave, Nancy Ross had no choice to be with her master, but after the slaves were freed, I would have assumed someone in that situation would have bolted. And again, there were not a lot of options for a black woman with young children right after the war, and what else could she have done? So let's go back to the death certificate. If Nancy was married to Alexander Morson Green, why was Ross still her last name? If they were ever officially married, I can't find the record. If you recall, the Supreme Court decision of Loving v. Virginia didn't get decided until June 12, 1967, so I assumed it was illegal for Alexander Morson and Nancy to be officially married. Turns out the law that the Supreme Court decision overturned, the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924, wasn't passed until the year of Nancy's death. Maybe some of the old slave codes or black codes from earlier covered this situation, but even if there were no such laws in the books in Virginia at the time, it was likely Virginia society would not have smiled down upon an interracial couple. Either way, Alexander Morson Green died in 1904, so he didn't really get a say if he was on the certificate or not. What is interesting, though, is that James Ross, one of Nancy's other sons, was the source of information listed on the death certificate, and apparently James thought of them as husband and wife. Let's bring this back to William Carter Ross, the guy who sent me down this rabbit hole. If you look at his marriage certificate to Mina Ashford, take a look at the witnesses to his second wedding. It's in the Oklahoma Territory in 1896, and there he is, A.M. Green, Alexander Morson Green. Now, he would have been about 69 years old when this happened, and if these kids were just mistakes with his side piece, or just a matter of convenience, I don't know if you travel hundreds of miles via horse and buggy to go to a wedding in the Wild West. Just seems a bit too far out of the way to just simply be convenience for a 69-year-old in that time and place. The icing on the cake is probably the fact that William Carter Ross named one of his children after his former master, Alexander Morson Ross. Do you name a child after someone you view negatively? Probably not. It just seems crazy to me, a person viewing a terrible part of history through a modern lens. But apparently, William Carter Ross didn't view his former master and father in a negative light, and I just find that extremely interesting. So what do you guys think? Was this possibly a real marriage between an interracial couple in Virginia 100 years before Loving versus Virginia? Or was it something else? I have more to share on William Carter Ross, but I'll leave it to you next time. In the meantime, be kind to one another.